What if I told you that the biggest threat to your success, your mental health, and your happiness isn't your competition, the economy, or even your own limiting beliefs? What if the real enemy is sitting right next to you in your office, living in your home, or pretending to be your friend? Toxic people are everywhere, and they're destroying lives, careers, and dreams every single day. But here's what most people don't understand. You don't have to be their victim. Every day, millions of good people lose sleep, question their self-worth, and sacrifice their potential because they don't know how to handle toxic individuals. They try to be nice, they try to reason, they try to change these people, and they end up drained, confused, and defeated. Meanwhile, toxic people continue their destructive patterns, moving from victim to victim, leaving a trail of damaged relationships and broken spirits behind them. But the most successful people in the world, the ones who stay ahead of 99% of the population, they've figured something out. They've learned that dealing with toxic people isn't about being mean or cruel. It's about being strategic. It's about understanding psychology, recognizing patterns, and implementing systems that protect your energy, your goals, and your peace of mind. This isn't just another feel-good motivational speech about positive thinking. This is a complete strategic guide to identifying, understanding, and neutralizing toxic behavior before it destroys what you've worked so hard to build. By the time you finish this, you'll never look at difficult people the same way again. You'll have the tools, the mindset, and the strategies to handle any toxic person who crosses your path. And you'll do it with confidence, clarity, and complete control. Chapter 1. The hidden cost of toxic people and why most people handle them wrong. Let me start with a truth that will shock you. The average person encounters at least 7 toxic individuals in their daily life, and most of them don't even realize it. These aren't just the obvious bullies or the screaming bosses. These are the subtle manipulators, the energy vampires, the passive-aggressive colleagues, and the guilt-tripping family members who slowly but systematically drain your mental resources and sabotage your success. The cost of toxic people goes far beyond hurt feelings or uncomfortable conversations. Research from Harvard Business School shows that a single toxic person in a workplace can decrease productivity by up to 40% for everyone around them. But the real damage isn't just professional, it's psychological. When you're constantly dealing with toxic behavior, your brain enters a state of chronic stress. Your cortisol levels remain elevated, your decision-making becomes impaired, and your creativity gets suffocated. Think about the last time you had to deal with a truly difficult person. How long did that interaction stay in your mind? If you're like most people, you probably replayed that conversation dozens of times, imagining what you should have said, analyzing their motives, and feeling frustrated about the outcome. That mental energy, that emotional bandwidth, that's energy that could have been used to build your business, improve your relationships, or pursue your goals. Most people handle toxic individuals in one of 4 destructive ways. First, they try to appease them. They think that if they're just nice enough, accommodating enough, or helpful enough, the toxic person will change their behavior. This never works, because toxic behavior isn't about you. It's about their need for control, attention, or power. When you appease toxic people, you're actually reinforcing their behavior and teaching them that their tactics work. The second common mistake is trying to reason with them. People spend hours explaining their perspective, presenting logical arguments, and trying to make toxic individuals see reason. But here's what they don't understand. Toxic people aren't operating from a place of logic. They're operating from a place of emotion, insecurity, and dysfunction. You cannot reason someone out of a position they didn't reason themselves into. The third mistake is fighting fire with fire. When people get frustrated with toxic behavior, they often respond by becoming toxic themselves. They match the aggression, they return the manipulation, they engage in the drama. This strategy fails because it drags you down to their level and gives them exactly what they want: your emotional reaction and your energy. The fourth and perhaps most dangerous mistake is complete avoidance without strategy. Some people think the solution is to simply ignore toxic people or cut them out of their lives entirely. While boundaries are crucial, mindless avoidance, without understanding the psychology behind toxic behavior, leaves you vulnerable to future manipulation and prevents you from developing the skills you need to handle difficult people effectively. The truth is, toxic people aren't going anywhere. They exist in every workplace, every social circle, and every family. The question isn't whether you'll encounter them, it's whether you'll be prepared when you do. Successful people understand that learning to handle toxic individuals is a crucial life skill, like learning to drive or learning to manage money. It's not optional if you want to protect your success and your sanity. Chapter 2. The 7 types of toxic people and how to identify them before they strike. Not all toxic people are created equal. Understanding the different types of toxic personalities is crucial because each type requires a different strategic response. Most people make the mistake of treating all difficult people the same way, which is why their strategies fail. Once you understand these 7 archetypes, you'll be able to identify toxic people within minutes of meeting them and adjust your approach accordingly. The first type is the energy vampire. These are the people who seem to suck the life out of every room they enter. They're chronic complainers, constant victims, and emotional black holes who feed off attention and sympathy. Energy vampires are masters of making everything about themselves. They interrupt conversations to share their own problems. They one-up your struggles with their own dramatic stories. And they never seem to have anything positive to say about anything. Energy vampires are particularly dangerous because they often appear harmless or even pitiable. They don't seem aggressive or threatening, so people let their guard down around them. But make no mistake, these individuals are toxic because they drain your emotional resources without ever giving anything back. They're emotional parasites who leave you feeling exhausted, frustrated, and emotionally depleted after every interaction. The second type is the controller. These individuals have an obsessive need to dominate every situation and every person around them. Controllers come in many forms. The micromanaging boss who can't delegate, the partner who needs to know your every move, the friend who always decides where the group goes and what they do. Controllers use a variety of tactics to maintain dominance, including guilt, fear, manipulation, and sometimes outright intimidation. What makes controllers particularly toxic is their inability to respect boundaries or autonomy. They see other people as extensions of themselves rather than as independent individuals with their own thoughts, feelings, and desires. Controllers will push and push until they find your breaking point, and then they'll use that information to manipulate you in the future. The third type is the narcissist. True narcissists are some of the most dangerous toxic people you'll encounter. because they're often charming, intelligent, and initially very appealing. Narcissists have an inflated sense of self-importance, a deep need for excessive attention and admiration, and a complete lack of empathy for others. They're masters of manipulation who will say and do whatever it takes to get what they want. Narcissists are particularly skilled at love bombing, which means they shower you with attention, compliments, and affection at the beginning of a relationship to hook you emotionally. Once they have you invested, they gradually reveal their true nature, demanding, critical, and completely self-centered. They'll take credit for your successes, blame you for their failures, and make you question your own reality through a process called gaslighting. The fourth type is the passive-aggressive saboteur. These individuals never confront you directly, but they undermine you through subtle, indirect actions. They agree to help you, but then forget or do a poor job. They make sarcastic comments disguised as jokes. They spread gossip or share your private information with others. They smile to your face while stabbing you in the back. Passive-aggressive people are toxic because they create an atmosphere of uncertainty and mistrust. You never know where you stand with them, and you're constantly walking on eggshells trying to avoid their subtle retaliation. They're particularly dangerous in workplace environments where they can sabotage your projects or reputation without leaving clear evidence of their actions. The fifth type is the emotional manipulator. These individuals are experts at using guilt, fear, and obligation to control others. They're the people who say things like, "If you really cared about me, you would," or "After everything I've done for you." They make you feel responsible for their emotions and use your empathy and compassion against you. Emotional manipulators are particularly effective with kind, caring people who naturally want to help others. They exploit your good nature and turn your strengths into vulnerabilities. They make you feel selfish for having boundaries and guilty for prioritizing your own needs. The sixth type is the chronic victim. While energy vampires complain about everything, chronic victims specifically position themselves as perpetual sufferers who are always being wronged by others. Nothing is ever their fault. They never take responsibility for their actions, and they always have someone else to blame for their problems. Chronic victims are toxic because they refuse to take any accountability for their lives while expecting others to constantly rescue them. They create drama and chaos wherever they go, and they use their victim status to manipulate others into helping them or excusing their bad behavior. The seventh and final type is the boundary violator. These individuals consistently ignore or push past the limits that others set. They show up uninvited, ask inappropriate questions, share information they shouldn't, and generally act as if normal social rules don't apply to them. Boundary violators often disguise their behavior as being friendly, caring, or just trying to help. Boundary violators are toxic because they refuse to respect your autonomy and personal space. They make you feel uncomfortable and unsafe, and they often escalate their behavior when you try to establish clear limits. Understanding these 7 types is the first step in developing an effective strategy for dealing with toxic people in your life. Chapter 3: The psychology behind toxic behavior and why they target successful people. To effectively deal with toxic people, you must understand what drives them. Toxic behavior isn't random or meaningless. It serves specific psychological functions for the people who engage in it. And once you understand these underlying motivations, you'll be able to predict their behavior and respond strategically rather than emotionally. At the core of most toxic behavior is deep-seated insecurity and a fragmented sense of self. Toxic people don't actually feel good about themselves, despite what their outward behavior might suggest. They suffer from what psychologists call emotional dysregulation, which means they can't manage their own emotions effectively. Instead of dealing with their internal pain and insecurity in healthy ways, they project it onto others through manipulation, control, and various forms of emotional abuse. Toxic people are often the product of childhood trauma, neglect, or dysfunction. They learned early in life that the world is an unsafe place where people can't be trusted and where they need to fight for every scrap of attention, love, or resources they can get. This creates what's known as an insecure attachment style, which affects how they relate to others for the rest of their lives. However, understanding the origins of toxic behavior doesn't mean you should excuse it or try to fix these people. That's one of the biggest mistakes that empathetic, successful people make. They think that if they can just show enough love, patience, or understanding, they can heal the toxic person's wounds and change their behavior. This is not only impossible, it's dangerous to your own well-being. Here's a crucial insight that most people miss. Toxic people specifically target successful, confident, and emotionally healthy individuals. This isn't coincidental. Toxic people are drawn to people who have what they lack: self-confidence, emotional stability, success, and positive energy. They see these qualities as something they can take or benefit from. Successful people make attractive targets for several reasons. First, they often have resources that toxic people want to access: money, connections, opportunities, or social status. Second, they tend to be generous and helpful by nature, which makes them vulnerable to manipulation. Third, their success makes toxic people feel inadequate by comparison, which triggers their need to tear others down to make themselves feel better. Toxic people also target successful individuals because they know that these people are often busy and distracted. Successful people are juggling multiple responsibilities and projects, which means they might not notice subtle manipulation tactics right away. They're also typically optimistic and solution-oriented, which means they'll often give toxic people the benefit of the doubt longer than they should. Another reason toxic people target successful individuals is that they're often isolated by their success. When you're achieving at a high level, you naturally have fewer peers and less social support, which makes you more vulnerable to toxic people who position themselves as allies or supporters. They exploit your need for connection and understanding. Toxic people also exploit what psychologists call the fundamental attribution error. This is the tendency for good people to attribute bad behavior to external circumstances rather than internal character flaws. When a toxic person treats you badly, your first instinct is to think they're having a bad day, they're under stress, or they didn't mean it the way it sounded. Toxic people count on this tendency because it allows them to continue their bad behavior without consequences. Understanding the psychology behind toxic behavior also reveals why traditional approaches to dealing with difficult people often fail. You can't reason with someone who isn't operating from a place of reason. You can't love someone into changing when their behavior serves important psychological functions for them. You can't set boundaries with someone who sees boundaries as challenges to overcome. The key insight is that toxic people don't want to change. Their behavior works for them. It gets them attention, control, resources, or whatever else they're seeking. They have no incentive to change as long as their tactics continue to be effective. This is why your response to toxic behavior is so crucial. When you react emotionally, when you try to appease them, when you engage in their drama, you're actually rewarding their behavior and encouraging them to continue. The most effective way to deal with toxic people is to understand that their behavior is about them, not about you. They're not targeting you because of something you did wrong or because you deserve to be treated badly. They're targeting you because you have something they want or because their psychological dysfunction compels them to seek out certain types of people to manipulate. This understanding is liberating because it removes the emotional charge from their behavior. When you realize that their actions are predictable responses to their own internal dysfunction, you can respond strategically rather than emotionally. You can protect yourself without taking their behavior personally, and you can maintain your power and peace of mind regardless of how they choose to act. Chapter 4. The 4 deadly mistakes that keep you stuck in toxic cycles. Most people who struggle with toxic individuals aren't failing because they're weak or naive. They're failing because they're making 4 specific strategic mistakes that actually enable and encourage toxic behavior. These mistakes are so common and so deeply ingrained in our social conditioning that most people don't even realize they're making them. Once you understand these patterns, you can break free from the toxic cycles that have been draining your energy and sabotaging your success. The first deadly mistake is the empathy trap. This is where your natural compassion and understanding become weapons that toxic people use against you. Empathetic people have a tendency to make excuses for bad behavior. When someone treats them poorly, they immediately start looking for explanations. Maybe this person had a difficult childhood. Maybe they're going through a tough time. Maybe they don't realize how their behavior affects others. While empathy is generally a positive trait, it becomes dangerous when you extend it to people who exploit it. Toxic people are experts at generating sympathy and playing the victim when they're confronted about their behavior. They'll tell you sob stories about their past. They'll cry. They'll apologize and promise to change. And they'll make you feel guilty for standing up for yourself. The empathy trap keeps you stuck because it prevents you from taking decisive action. Instead of setting clear boundaries or removing toxic people from your life, you keep giving them chances to change. You keep hoping that if you're just patient enough or understanding enough, they'll suddenly become the person you want them to be. This never happens because toxic people don't change unless they face serious consequences for their behavior. The second deadly mistake is the logic fallacy. This is the belief that you can reason with toxic people if you just find the right words or the right approach. Rational people assume that others are rational too, so they spend enormous amounts of time and energy trying to explain their perspective, defend their position, or convince toxic people to see reason. The logic fallacy is particularly dangerous because it can consume years of your life. You'll have the same arguments over and over again, present the same evidence repeatedly, and exhaust yourself trying to make someone understand something they have no interest in understanding. Toxic people don't engage in logical discussions because they're not interested in finding truth or solving problems. They're interested in winning, controlling, or getting attention. When you try to reason with toxic people, you're actually giving them more opportunities to manipulate you. They'll twist your words, change the subject, bring up past grievances, or use various other tactics to keep you engaged in pointless debates. Meanwhile, you're wasting precious time and energy that could be used to build your business, improve your relationships, or pursue your goals. The third deadly mistake is the reaction addiction. This happens when you become so focused on responding to toxic behavior that you lose sight of your own goals and priorities. Toxic people are experts at pushing buttons and triggering emotional reactions. They know exactly what to say or do to make you angry, hurt, or frustrated, and they use these reactions to control your behavior. When you're caught in the reaction addiction, your life starts revolving around toxic people instead of around your own objectives. You spend your mental energy thinking about what they said, planning your response, or trying to predict their next move. You make decisions based on how they might react, rather than on what's best for you. You become reactive instead of proactive, and you lose control of your own life. The reaction addiction is particularly insidious because it can make you feel like you're doing something productive. You're responding. You're defending yourself. You're fighting back. But in reality, you're dancing to their tune and giving them exactly what they want: your attention and your emotional energy. Every time you react, you're reinforcing their behavior and encouraging them to continue. The fourth and final deadly mistake is the savior complex. This is the belief that you can fix or change toxic people through your love, patience, or support. People with savior complexes see toxic individuals as wounded souls who just need the right person to help them heal. They think they can be the exception, the one person who finally gets through to them and helps them become better. The savior complex is extremely dangerous because it keeps you invested in relationships that are fundamentally unhealthy and destructive. You'll tolerate abuse, manipulation, and disrespect because you believe you're helping someone heal. You'll sacrifice your own well-being for the fantasy of saving someone who doesn't want to be saved. Toxic people love people with savior complexes because they provide an endless source of attention, resources, and emotional energy. They'll play into your desire to help by positioning themselves as victims who need your unique understanding and support. They'll make you feel special and important while simultaneously draining you of everything you have to give. The savior complex is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how change works. People don't change because someone loves them enough or tries hard enough. People change when they decide to change, usually because they face consequences that make their current behavior too costly to continue. You cannot love someone into changing, and trying to do so will only exhaust you and enable their toxic behavior. These four mistakes create a cycle that keeps you trapped in toxic relationships. The empathy trap makes you vulnerable to manipulation. The logic fallacy wastes your time and energy. The reaction addiction gives toxic people control over your emotions. And the savior complex keeps you invested in people who will never change. Breaking free from these patterns requires a fundamental shift in how you think about toxic people and how you respond to their behavior. The key is to recognize that dealing with toxic people is not about being understanding, reasonable, responsive, or helpful. It's about being strategic, boundaried, and focused on your own goals and well-being. When you stop making these four deadly mistakes, you'll immediately feel more powerful and more in control of your relationships and your life. Chapter 5. The strategic mindset shift that changes everything. Everything changes when you stop trying to change toxic people and start focusing on changing your response to them. This isn't just a subtle adjustment in approach. It's a complete paradigm shift that will revolutionize how you handle difficult people and protect your mental energy. Most people waste years trying to fix others when the real power lies in controlling yourself. The traditional approach to dealing with difficult people is based on the false belief that if you can just find the right words, the right approach, or the right amount of patience, you can make them see reason and change their behavior. This approach fails because it gives toxic people all the power. You're essentially saying that your peace of mind and your success depend on their willingness to cooperate, which puts you in a permanently vulnerable position. The strategic mindset shift begins with accepting a fundamental truth. You cannot control other people's behavior, but you have complete control over your response to their behavior. This might seem obvious, but most people live as if the opposite were true. They spend enormous amounts of energy trying to change others while neglecting the one thing they actually have power over, themselves. When you embrace this shift, everything becomes simpler and more effective. Instead of asking, "How can I make this person stop being toxic?" you start asking, "How can I protect myself from this person's toxicity?" Instead of trying to convince them to treat you better, you focus on creating consequences that make their bad behavior costly for them. Instead of hoping they'll change, you change how you interact with them. This strategic approach is based on understanding leverage and power dynamics. Toxic people continue their behavior because it works for them. They get attention, control, resources, or emotional reactions from their targets. When you stop providing these rewards and start imposing costs for their behavior, you shift the power dynamic in your favor. The strategic mindset also recognizes that your time and energy are your most valuable resources. Every minute you spend trying to reason with a toxic person is a minute you're not spending on building your career, improving your relationships, or pursuing your goals. Successful people understand that their attention is precious and they guard it carefully. They don't waste it on people who drain rather than energize them. Another crucial aspect of the strategic mindset is understanding that you don't owe toxic people anything. You don't owe them your patience, your understanding, your forgiveness, or your continued presence in their lives. Many people struggle with guilt when they start setting boundaries with toxic individuals because they've been conditioned to believe that being a good person means being endlessly accommodating. But here's the truth. Being kind doesn't mean being a doormat. Being compassionate doesn't mean accepting abuse. Being understanding doesn't mean enabling destructive behavior. In fact, the kindest thing you can do for toxic people is to stop rewarding their bad behavior, because this is the only thing that might motivate them to change. The strategic mindset also involves thinking in terms of return on investment. For every relationship in your life, you should be able to identify what you're investing and what you're getting back. Healthy relationships are characterized by mutual benefit, reciprocity, and positive energy exchange. Toxic relationships are characterized by one-sided giving, emotional drainage, and negative outcomes. When you apply this investment thinking to your relationships, you'll quickly identify which ones are worth your time and energy, and which ones are net negatives that need to be eliminated or radically restructured. This isn't about being selfish or calculating. It's about being strategic and protecting your resources so you can be more effective in all areas of your life. The strategic mindset shift also changes how you interpret toxic behavior. Instead of taking it personally or seeing it as a reflection of your worth, you start seeing it as information about the other person's psychological state and capabilities. When someone treats you badly, it tells you something important about their character, their values, and their level of emotional development. This perspective is incredibly liberating because it removes the emotional charge from toxic interactions. You don't get angry when a scorpion stings, because that's what scorpions do. Similarly, when you truly understand that toxic behavior is about the other person's dysfunction rather than about you, you can respond calmly and strategically rather than emotionally. Finally, the strategic mindset recognizes that your reputation and your relationships are crucial assets that need to be protected. Toxic people can damage both through their behavior and their influence on others. Part of being strategic involves managing how you're perceived and ensuring that your association with toxic individuals doesn't harm your standing with others. This mindset shift is the foundation for everything else you'll learn about dealing with toxic people. Once you stop trying to change them and start focusing on protecting and empowering yourself, you'll find that you have far more control over these situations than you ever imagined. You'll also discover that many problems that seemed impossible to solve become much more manageable when approached strategically rather than emotionally. Chapter 6. The Tactical Response System for each type of toxic person. Now that you understand the psychology behind toxic behavior and the strategic mindset required to deal with it effectively, let's get into the specific tactics you need for each type of toxic person. Remember, one-size-fits-all approaches fail because different toxic personalities require different strategic responses. What works with an energy vampire will backfire with a controller, and what neutralizes a narcissist might empower a passive-aggressive saboteur. When dealing with energy vampires, your primary strategy is energy conservation and redirection. These individuals feed off your emotional energy and attention, so your goal is to starve them of what they need while protecting your own resources. The most effective technique is called the gray rock method. You become as boring and unresponsive as possible during interactions. Give short, factual responses without emotional content. Don't ask follow-up questions about their problems, don't offer solutions, and don't show sympathy for their latest crisis. For example, when an energy vampire starts complaining about their job for the 100th time, instead of saying, "Oh no, what happened now?" you simply say, "That sounds frustrating," and immediately change the subject, or excuse yourself from the conversation. You're acknowledging their statement without feeding into their need for attention and drama. Over time, they'll find you less satisfying to interact with and will move on to more responsive targets. Controllers require a completely different approach because they interpret any sign of weakness or accommodation as an invitation to increase their dominance. With controllers, you must establish and maintain firm boundaries from the very beginning. The key is to be consistently assertive without being aggressive. You state your position clearly. You don't justify or explain extensively. And you don't negotiate on non-negotiable issues. When a controller tries to micromanage your work, you don't argue about whether their oversight is necessary. Instead, you say something like, "I understand your concerns. I'll update you on my progress at our scheduled weekly meeting." Then you do exactly what you said you would do, nothing more and nothing less. Controllers respect consistency and strength. so you must never waver once you've established a boundary. Narcissists are perhaps the most challenging toxic people to deal with because they're often intelligent, charming, and skilled at manipulation. The key to handling narcissists is to never give them the admiration and attention they crave, while also never directly challenging their inflated self-image. This requires a delicate balance that I call strategic indifference. With narcissists, you acknowledge their statements without praising or criticizing them. When they brag about their achievements, you say, "That's interesting," rather than, "Wow, that's amazing." When they fish for compliments, you redirect the conversation rather than feeding their ego. The goal is to be polite but unengaging, present but not invested. Narcissists will eventually find you boring and move on to more responsive sources of admiration. Passive-aggressive saboteurs require direct confrontation, which is the opposite of what most people expect. These individuals count on others being too polite or conflict-averse to call out their behavior directly. They hide behind plausible deniability and act innocent when confronted. The most effective strategy is to make their behavior explicit and public. When a passive-aggressive person forgets to do something important, you don't accept their excuse. You say, "This is the third time this has happened. Going forward, I need you to confirm receipt of all requests in writing and provide status updates every 2 days." You're not accusing them of intentional sabotage, but you're making it clear that you see the pattern and you're implementing safeguards. Emotional manipulators try to control you through guilt, fear, and obligation. The key to dealing with them is to separate their emotions from your decisions. When an emotional manipulator says, "If you really cared about me, you would do this," you respond with, "I do care about you, and that's why I'm not going to do something that isn't good for either of us." You acknowledge their feelings without accepting responsibility for managing them. Chronic victims need to face the consequences of their choices without being rescued. Every time you solve their problems or make excuses for their behavior, you enable their victim mentality. Instead, when they come to you with their latest crisis, you express sympathy but don't offer solutions. You say things like, "That sounds really difficult. What do you think you're going to do about it?" You force them to take ownership of their problems, rather than taking ownership yourself. Boundary violators must face immediate and consistent consequences for their behavior. The moment someone crosses a boundary you've established, you address it directly and implement a consequence. If someone shows up to your home uninvited after you've asked them to call first, you don't let them in. You speak to them at the door and tell them they need to leave and call to schedule a time to visit. The key to all of these strategies is consistency. Toxic people will test your boundaries repeatedly to see if you'll maintain them. They'll escalate their behavior temporarily when you first start implementing these techniques, because they're trying to regain control. This is called an extinction burst in psychology, and it's actually a sign that your strategy is working. If you remain consistent, their behavior will eventually decrease because it's no longer effective. Chapter 7. The Art of Unbreakable Boundaries and How to Enforce Them. Boundaries are the foundation of all healthy relationships, but they're absolutely critical when dealing with toxic people. Most people think they understand boundaries, but they're actually implementing them incorrectly, which is why toxic individuals continue to violate them. A boundary isn't a request or a suggestion. It's a limit that you set and enforce regardless of how others respond to it. The first mistake people make with boundaries is thinking they need the other person's agreement or cooperation. They say things like, "I need you to respect my boundaries," or "Can you please not call me after 9 p.m.?" This approach fails because it gives the other person power over your boundary. A true boundary is something you control entirely. It's not about changing their behavior. It's about controlling your response to their behavior. A properly set boundary sounds like this: "I don't take work calls after 9 p.m. If you call me after that time, I won't answer." Notice that this statement doesn't require the other person to do anything differently. It simply informs them of what you will and won't do. The boundary exists whether they respect it or not, because you're the one enforcing it through your actions. The second mistake people make is setting boundaries without consequences. A boundary without a consequence is just a suggestion. When someone violates your boundary, there must be an immediate and consistent response that makes their behavior costly for them. This doesn't mean being cruel or vindictive. It means following through on what you said you would do. If you told someone you won't discuss work during family dinner and they bring up a project anyway, you don't argue about it or remind them of your boundary. You either change the subject immediately or excuse yourself from the table. Your action demonstrates that violating your boundary results in the loss of your attention and presence, which is a natural consequence that reinforces the boundary. The third mistake is explaining or justifying your boundaries extensively. When you over-explain boundaries, you're essentially asking for permission to have them, which undermines their effectiveness. Toxic people will use your explanations against you, finding exceptions and loopholes or arguing about the validity of your reasons. Strong boundaries are stated simply and clearly, without extensive justification. For example, if you decide you won't lend money to a particular person anymore, you don't need to explain your financial situation or justify your decision. You simply say, "I'm not able to lend money anymore," and leave it at that. If they push for an explanation, you can repeat the same statement or say, "That's just not something I'm comfortable with anymore." The fourth critical aspect of boundary setting is understanding the difference between boundaries and ultimatums. Boundaries are about controlling your own behavior, while ultimatums are about controlling someone else's behavior. Ultimatums often backfire because they create power struggles and can be called as bluffs. Boundaries, on the other hand, are simply statements of fact about what you will and won't do. When setting boundaries with toxic people, you must be prepared for them to test and challenge those boundaries. This is not a sign that your boundaries are wrong or ineffective. It's a predictable response that you should expect and prepare for. Toxic people have learned that persistence often pays off, so they'll escalate their behavior temporarily to see if you'll give in. This testing phase is crucial because it determines whether your boundary will be respected long term. If you give in even once during this testing phase, you've taught the toxic person that your boundaries aren't real and that they can be overcome with enough pressure. This actually makes their future behavior worse because they now know that persistence works with you. The key to surviving the testing phase is to have your consequences planned in advance and to implement them immediately and consistently. Don't wait to see if the behavior will improve or give multiple warnings. The moment your boundary is crossed, implement the consequence you've predetermined. This might mean ending a conversation, leaving a social gathering, hanging up the phone, or temporarily cutting off contact. Another important aspect of boundary enforcement is documentation, especially in professional settings. When someone repeatedly violates your boundaries at work, keep records of these incidents, including dates, times, witnesses, and the specific behavior that occurred. This documentation becomes crucial if you need to involve HR or management in addressing the situation. It's also important to understand that boundaries must evolve as situations change. What worked in one context might not work in another, and you may need to adjust your boundaries as you learn more about a person's behavior patterns. This isn't a sign of weakness or inconsistency. It's intelligent adaptation to new information. Finally, remember that setting boundaries with toxic people often involves short-term discomfort for long-term peace. They may react badly when you first start enforcing limits. They may accuse you of being unreasonable or selfish, and they may try to guilt or manipulate you into backing down. This temporary escalation is the price you pay for long-term freedom from their toxic behavior. The most successful people understand that their time, energy, and peace of mind are too valuable to be constantly under attack from boundary violators. They set clear limits, enforce them consistently, and create lives where toxic behavior simply isn't tolerated. When you master the art of unbreakable boundaries, you'll find that many of your relationship problems solve themselves because people quickly learn how they can and can't treat you. Chapter 8: Emotional Protection Protocols and Mental Armor Techniques. Dealing with toxic people isn't just about external strategies and boundary setting. You also need internal protection systems that shield your emotional well-being and prevent their negativity from infiltrating your mental space. Most people focus exclusively on changing the external situation, while leaving themselves emotionally vulnerable to manipulation and psychological damage. The first level of emotional protection is what I call mental compartmentalization. This is the ability to separate their behavior from your self-worth and emotional state. When toxic people attack, criticize, or try to make you feel bad about yourself, you must have a mental system that prevents their words from penetrating your core sense of self. Mental compartmentalization works by recognizing that their opinion of you is really a reflection of their internal state rather than an accurate assessment of your worth. When someone criticizes you unfairly or tries to make you feel guilty for setting boundaries, you mentally categorize their words as information about their dysfunction rather than information about me. This requires developing what psychologists call an internal locus of control. This means that your sense of self-worth and emotional stability comes from within rather than from external validation or criticism. People with strong internal locus of control don't get devastated by criticism because they have a stable sense of who they are that isn't dependent on others' opinions. The second emotional protection technique is emotional buffering. This involves creating psychological distance between yourself and toxic people's emotions. Toxic people often try to transfer their emotional state to you through various manipulation tactics. They want you to feel as angry, frustrated, or upset as they are, because this gives them control over your emotional state. Emotional buffering works by recognizing that you don't have to absorb or mirror someone else's emotions. When someone is angry at you, you don't have to become angry back. When someone is trying to make you feel guilty, you don't have to accept that guilt. You can acknowledge their emotional state without taking it on yourself. One powerful technique for emotional buffering is visualization. Before interacting with a toxic person, visualize yourself surrounded by an invisible shield that deflects their negative energy. Imagine their criticism, manipulation, or anger bouncing off this shield rather than penetrating into your emotional core. This might sound simplistic, but visualization techniques have been proven effective by sports psychologists and performance coaches for decades. The third protection technique is strategic emotional detachment. This doesn't mean becoming cold or uncaring. It means maintaining appropriate emotional distance from people who use your emotions against you. Many people make the mistake of being emotionally invested in toxic people's approval, happiness, or success. This investment gives toxic people power over your emotional state. Strategic emotional detachment means you care about people's well-being in general, but you don't make their emotional state your responsibility. You can wish someone well without being emotionally devastated when they're unhappy. You can hope they make good choices without feeling responsible when they make bad ones. This is particularly important with family members or long-term friends who have become toxic. You don't have to stop loving them, but you do need to stop making their emotions your priority. You can love someone from a distance and maintain emotional boundaries that protect your own well-being. The fourth technique is cognitive reframing. This involves consciously changing how you interpret and think about toxic people's behavior. Instead of seeing their attacks as evidence that something is wrong with you, you reframe them as evidence that something is wrong with them. Instead of seeing their manipulation attempts as successful, you see them as desperate acts by people who lack healthy relationship skills. Cognitive reframing also involves focusing on what you can learn from difficult interactions rather than just how they make you feel. Every encounter with a toxic person is an opportunity to practice your boundary-setting skills, test your emotional protection techniques, and gather information about their behavior patterns. The fifth protection technique is energy management. Toxic people are emotional energy drains, so you need systematic ways to restore and protect your energy levels. This includes both preventing energy loss and actively restoring energy that's been depleted. Energy management starts with recognizing the early warning signs that your emotional resources are being depleted. These might include feeling irritable, having trouble concentrating, feeling overwhelmed by small problems, or finding yourself dwelling on interactions with toxic people. When you notice these signs, you need to implement energy restoration techniques immediately. Energy restoration techniques include physical activities that ground you, such as exercise, spending time in nature, or engaging in hobbies you enjoy. They also include social activities with positive, supportive people who energize rather than drain you. The key is to be intentional about scheduling these activities rather than waiting until you feel completely depleted. The sixth and final protection technique is psychological documentation. This involves keeping a mental or written record of toxic people's behavior patterns so you can predict and prepare for future interactions. When you document their tactics, you start to see patterns that make their behavior more predictable and less emotionally jarring. Psychological documentation also helps you maintain perspective when toxic people try to gaslight you or make you question your memory of events. When you have a clear record of their behavior, it's much harder for them to convince you that you're remembering things incorrectly or overreacting to their actions. These emotional protection techniques work together to create what I call psychological immunity to toxic behavior. Just as your physical immune system protects you from biological threats, your psychological immune system protects you from emotional and mental threats. The stronger your psychological immunity, the less damage toxic people can do to your well-being and success. Chapter 9. Advanced Communication Strategies that Disarm and Neutralize Toxic Behavior. Communication with toxic people requires a completely different skill set than normal social interaction. Traditional communication approaches like active listening, empathy, and collaborative problem-solving often backfire with toxic individuals because they exploit these techniques for their own advantage. You need specialized communication strategies that protect you while neutralizing their ability to manipulate or control the interaction. The first advanced technique is called strategic non-engagement. This involves recognizing which conversations are worth having and which ones are traps designed to waste your time and energy. Toxic people often initiate conversations that have no possibility of positive resolution. They bring up past grievances, argue about things that can't be changed, or try to engage you in circular debates with no clear objective. When someone tries to pull you into a non-productive conversation, you use strategic non-engagement by refusing to participate. You might say something like, "I don't think this conversation is going to be productive for either of us," and then physically remove yourself from the situation. You don't argue about whether the conversation could be productive. You don't explain why you're leaving, and you don't get drawn into defending your decision to disengage. The second technique is information diet. This involves severely limiting the personal information you share with toxic people. Toxic individuals use personal information as ammunition for future attacks or manipulation attempts. They remember your insecurities, your fears, your goals, and your relationships. And they use this information strategically when they want to hurt or control you. When dealing with toxic people, you share only the minimum information necessary for the relationship to function. You don't discuss your personal problems, your financial situation, your relationship issues, or your career concerns. You keep conversations focused on immediate, practical matters and redirect personal questions back to business or neutral topics. The third technique is emotional validation without agreement. This allows you to acknowledge someone's feelings without agreeing with their perspective or taking responsibility for their emotional state. Many people think they have to either validate someone's emotions completely or dismiss them entirely. But there's a middle ground that's much more effective with toxic individuals. For example, if someone says, "You made me so angry when you didn't return my call immediately," you can respond with, "I can see that you're frustrated about the delayed response," without accepting responsibility for their anger or agreeing that your behavior was inappropriate. You're acknowledging their emotional state without endorsing their interpretation of events. The fourth technique is broken record. This involves repeating the same response consistently when someone tries to argue with or manipulate you into changing your position. Toxic people often use persistence and escalation to wear down your resistance. They'll argue, plead, threaten, or guilt trip you until you give them what they want. The broken record technique neutralizes this strategy by removing the variability that they're trying to exploit. When someone keeps asking you to do something you've already declined, you simply repeat the same response without elaboration or justification. "I'm not available to help with that," becomes your standard response, no matter how they phrase their request or what tactics they use to try to change your mind. The fifth technique is strategic questions. Instead of making statements that toxic people can argue with or attack, you ask questions that force them to reveal their true motivations or confront the logical inconsistencies in their position. This technique is particularly effective with manipulative people who rely on emotional manipulation rather than logical arguments. For example, if someone is trying to guilt you into doing something by saying, "If you really cared about me, you would do this," you can respond with, "What makes you think that doing this particular thing is the only way to show that I care?" This question forces them to defend their logic rather than allowing them to manipulate your emotions. The sixth technique is deflection and redirection. When toxic people try to blame you for their problems or make you responsible for their emotions, you deflect the blame back to them and redirect the conversation towards solutions they can implement themselves. This prevents you from getting trapped in discussions about who's at fault while encouraging them to take responsibility for their own issues. If someone says, "You're making me feel bad," you can respond with, "That sounds frustrating for you. What do you think you could do to feel better?" You're not accepting responsibility for their emotions, but you're also not arguing about whether you caused them. You're simply redirecting the focus toward what they can do to solve their own problem. The seventh technique is time limiting. This involves setting specific time boundaries for interactions with toxic people and sticking to them regardless of how the conversation is going. Many toxic people use time pressure and extended discussions to wear down your resistance and get what they want. Before interacting with a toxic person, decide how much time you're willing to invest in the conversation and announce this limit at the beginning. "I have about 10 minutes to discuss this," gives you a natural exit strategy and prevents them from trapping you in endless circular discussions. The eighth and final technique is documentation and witnesses. In situations where you need to interact with toxic people regularly, especially in professional settings, you document important conversations and include witnesses whenever possible. This protects you from gaslighting attempts and provides evidence if the situation escalates to the point where you need outside intervention. Documentation doesn't mean recording conversations without permission, which can create legal issues. It means sending follow-up emails that summarize what was discussed and agreed upon, copying relevant supervisors or colleagues on important communications, and keeping records of when toxic behavior occurs. These advanced communication strategies work because they remove the elements that toxic people depend on for their manipulation: your emotional reactivity, your need for their approval, your willingness to accept responsibility for their problems, and your assumption that they're operating in good faith. When you master these techniques, you'll find that toxic people either modify their behavior when interacting with you or they avoid you altogether, both of which are positive outcomes. Chapter 10. The Strategic Decision Matrix. When to fight, when to flee, when to stay. One of the most challenging aspects of dealing with toxic people is knowing when to invest energy in addressing the situation and when to simply remove yourself from it entirely. Many people waste years trying to fix relationships that can't be fixed, while others give up too quickly on situations that could be resolved with the right strategy. Making the wrong choice can cost you years of your life and enormous amounts of emotional energy. The strategic decision matrix is a systematic framework for evaluating your options when dealing with toxic people. It considers 4 key factors: the relationship's importance to your goals, your ability to influence the situation, the cost of continued engagement, and the availability of alternatives. By analyzing these factors objectively, you can make rational decisions rather than emotional ones. The first factor is relationship importance. Not all relationships are equally crucial to your success and well-being. A toxic boss who controls your career advancement requires a different strategy than a toxic neighbor who has no impact on your professional life. A toxic family member who will be in your life for decades needs different handling than a toxic acquaintance you can easily avoid. To assess relationship importance, ask yourself these questions. Does this person have power over my career, finances, or living situation? Will I be forced to interact with them regularly regardless of my preferences? Do they have influence over other important relationships in my life? Are they connected to goals or opportunities that matter to me? The higher the importance, the more effort it's worth investing in finding a solution rather than simply avoiding the person. The second factor is your ability to influence the situation. Some toxic people can be managed or neutralized through the strategies we've discussed, while others are completely resistant to change. Your ability to influence depends on several variables: your position relative to theirs, their level of psychological dysfunction, the support you have from others, and the consequences you can impose for their behavior. People with severe personality disorders, active addictions, or deep-seated psychological problems are generally not influenced by boundary setting or strategic communication. They require professional intervention or complete avoidance. On the other hand, people who are toxic due to stress, poor modeling, or lack of awareness can often be managed effectively with consistent boundaries and consequences. The third factor is the cost of continued engagement. Every relationship requires an investment of time, energy, and emotional resources. With toxic people, this investment is often much higher than normal because you have to maintain constant vigilance, implement protection strategies, and deal with the stress of their behavior. You need to honestly assess whether the benefits of maintaining the relationship outweigh these costs. Consider not just the immediate costs, but the long-term impact on your mental health, your other relationships, and your ability to pursue your goals. If dealing with a toxic person is consuming a significant portion of your mental energy and preventing you from focusing on more important priorities, the cost may be too high regardless of other factors. The fourth factor is the availability of alternatives. Sometimes you have options for achieving your goals or meeting your needs without maintaining a relationship with a toxic person. Other times, they're the only path to something important, at least in the short term. Understanding your alternatives helps you make strategic rather than emotional decisions about how to handle the situation. Based on these 4 factors, toxic relationships generally fall into one of 4 categories, each requiring a different strategic response. The first category is high importance, high influence. These are situations where the relationship matters significantly to your goals, and you have realistic hope of improving the situation through strategic intervention. For high importance, high influence situations, you fight. You invest time and energy in implementing boundaries, consequences, and strategic communication techniques. You document problems, build alliances with others, and work systematically to change the dynamic. This might involve having difficult conversations, involving supervisors or HR departments, or implementing structured intervention plans. The second category is high importance, low influence. These are situations where you need to maintain some relationship with the person, but they're resistant to change, and you have limited power to influence their behavior. This often occurs with family members, long-term business partners, or situations where you have no choice but to interact with someone regularly. For high importance, low influence situations, you stay, but you implement maximum protection strategies. You minimize contact as much as possible, maintain strict boundaries, use all the emotional protection techniques we've discussed, and focus on managing your own response rather than trying to change theirs. You accept that the relationship will never be ideal, but you find ways to coexist while protecting your well-being. The third category is low importance, high influence. These are situations where the relationship isn't crucial to your major goals, but the person's behavior is problematic, and you have the power to address it. This might include toxic friends, casual acquaintances, or neighbors whose behavior affects your quality of life. For low importance, high influence situations, you have flexibility in your approach. You can choose to invest some energy in setting boundaries and consequences if you think the relationship has potential, or you can simply reduce contact without extensive intervention. The key is not to invest more energy than the relationship warrants. The fourth category is low importance, low influence. These are toxic people who have minimal impact on your important goals and who are resistant to change. This includes casual acquaintances, distant family members you rarely see, or people you encounter occasionally in social or professional settings. For low importance, low influence situations, you flee. You remove these people from your life as completely as possible without extensive explanation or intervention attempts. You unfriend them on social media, decline invitations to events where they'll be present, and avoid situations where you'll be forced to interact with them. You don't waste energy trying to fix relationships that don't matter to your success or happiness. The strategic decision matrix isn't just a one-time assessment. Relationships and circumstances change, so you should periodically reevaluate your approach. Someone who was once important to your goals might become less relevant as your life changes. Your ability to influence a situation might increase as you gain more power or support, or it might decrease as their dysfunction becomes more severe. The key insight is that your time and energy are finite resources that should be allocated strategically rather than emotionally. Every hour you spend trying to fix an unfixable relationship is an hour you're not spending on building positive relationships, pursuing your goals, or improving your own skills and capabilities. Successful people are ruthless about protecting their most valuable resource, their attention. They invest it where it will generate the highest return, and they don't waste it on people who consistently drain rather than energize them. Chapter 11. Mastering Workplace Toxic Politics Without Destroying Your Career. The workplace presents unique challenges when dealing with toxic people because you can't simply cut them out of your life like you can with toxic friends or acquaintances. Your career, your income, and your professional reputation are all at stake, which means you need sophisticated strategies that protect you while advancing your goals. The key is learning to navigate workplace toxicity without becoming toxic yourself or sacrificing your professional success. The first principle of workplace toxic management is understanding that perception is reality in professional environments. How others perceive your interactions with toxic colleagues can be more important than the actual facts of the situation. This means you must always maintain professional behavior, even when others don't, because your reputation depends on how you handle difficult situations under pressure. When dealing with toxic colleagues, document everything, but do it strategically. Keep records of important conversations, missed deadlines, inappropriate behavior, and any instances where their actions impact your work or the team's performance. However, don't make your documentation obvious or turn it into a weapon that you wave around. Professional documentation should be factual, objective, and focused on business impact rather than personal grievances. Email is your best friend when dealing with workplace toxic people because it creates an automatic paper trail. After important verbal conversations, send a follow-up email summarizing what was discussed and what actions were agreed upon. This prevents gaslighting and creates accountability. When someone tries to deny what they committed to, you have written evidence of the original agreement. The CC strategy is particularly powerful in workplace settings. When you need to communicate with a toxic person about something important, copy their supervisor or other relevant stakeholders on the email. This serves multiple purposes. It ensures transparency. It makes the toxic person more likely to behave professionally since others are watching, and it creates witnesses to their behavior patterns. Toxic bosses require special handling because the power dynamic is fundamentally different than with peers or subordinates. You cannot set boundaries with a toxic boss the same way you would with a toxic colleague, because they have authority over your employment and career advancement. However, you're not powerless in these situations if you understand how to manage up strategically. The key to handling toxic bosses is giving them what they want while protecting what you need. Most toxic bosses want control, recognition, and the feeling that they're important and respected. You can provide these things without sacrificing your integrity or effectiveness. This might mean updating them more frequently than necessary, acknowledging their ideas publicly, or asking for their input on decisions you could make independently. At the same time, you protect your own interests by building relationships with other leaders in the organization, documenting your contributions and achievements, and developing skills that make you valuable to other departments or companies. The goal is to make yourself as indispensable as possible while creating options for yourself if the situation becomes unbearable. Alliance building is crucial in workplace environments because isolation makes you vulnerable to toxic people's attacks. Identify the influential, reasonable people in your organization and cultivate positive relationships with them. These allies can provide support, perspective, and protection when toxic individuals try to undermine you. However, be careful not to turn alliance building into gossip or backstabbing. Professional allies should be people who know your work quality and character, not people who bond with you over complaining about difficult colleagues. The difference is that professional allies will defend your reputation based on their direct experience working with you, while gossip partners might turn against you if it serves their interests. When toxic people try to sabotage your projects or reputation, respond strategically rather than emotionally. Don't defend yourself publicly or try to prove that they're lying or incompetent. Instead, let your work speak for itself, while quietly gathering evidence of their destructive behavior. Focus on delivering excellent results consistently, which makes their criticisms less credible and their sabotage attempts more obvious. The professional boundary technique is essential for workplace environments. This involves maintaining appropriate emotional distance from colleagues while still being collaborative and pleasant. You don't share personal information that could be used against you. You don't get drawn into office drama or gossip. And you don't make colleagues your primary source of emotional support or validation. Professional boundaries also mean you don't take work conflicts personally, even when toxic people try to make them personal. When someone attacks your ideas or your work, you respond to the business issues without defending your ego or attacking theirs. This professional demeanor makes you appear more competent and trustworthy, while making them appear petty and unprofessional. Managing toxic customers or clients requires a different approach because these relationships directly impact revenue and business success. The key is setting clear expectations and boundaries from the beginning of the relationship, before problems arise. This includes defining scope of work, communication protocols, revision limits, and payment terms in writing. When clients become abusive or unreasonable, you have several options depending on the value of the relationship and your company's policies. You can involve your supervisor or account management team. You can require all communication to go through a third party, or in extreme cases, you can fire the client if the relationship is more costly than profitable. The most important workplace principle is never burning bridges unnecessarily. Even when someone treats you badly, you maintain professional courtesy. Because industries are smaller than they appear, and people's careers often intersect in unexpected ways. This doesn't mean you have to be best friends with toxic colleagues, but it does mean you don't create enemies unnecessarily. Finally, remember that your career is a long-term game that extends beyond any single job or toxic person. Sometimes the strategic choice is to tolerate a difficult situation temporarily while you build skills, gain experience, or wait for better opportunities. The key is making these decisions consciously based on your career goals, rather than reacting emotionally to day-to-day frustrations. Chapter 12. Family Dynamics and Toxic Relatives. You cannot escape. Family relationships present the most complex challenges when dealing with toxic people because these connections are permanent and loaded with emotional history, cultural expectations, and shared trauma. You cannot fire a toxic family member, and completely cutting contact often comes with significant social and emotional costs. This requires sophisticated strategies that protect your well-being while maintaining necessary family connections. The first challenge with toxic family members is overcoming the family loyalty trap. This is the belief that family members deserve unlimited patience, forgiveness, and support regardless of how they treat you. Society reinforces this belief through cultural messages about family being everything, blood being thicker than water, and family members always being there for each other. However, the reality is that sharing DNA or growing up in the same household doesn't automatically create healthy, functional relationships. Some family members are genuinely toxic people who happen to be related to you, and treating them differently than you would treat toxic strangers only enables their behavior and makes you more vulnerable to their manipulation. The key insight is that you can love family members while still protecting yourself from their toxic behavior. Love doesn't require accepting abuse, manipulation, or disrespect. You can care about someone's well-being while refusing to tolerate their destructive actions. This distinction is crucial because it allows you to maintain family connections without sacrificing your mental health or success. Toxic parents present unique challenges because the parent-child relationship is foundational to your psychological development and self-concept. If you grew up with toxic parents, you may have internalized their critical messages, learned dysfunctional relationship patterns, or developed trauma responses that affect all your adult relationships. Healing from toxic parenting requires recognizing that your parents' treatment of you was about their limitations and dysfunction, not about your worth or lovability. Children naturally assume that their parents' behavior reflects their own value, but this assumption is often incorrect. Toxic parents often treat their children badly because of their own unresolved trauma, mental health issues, or emotional immaturity. Setting boundaries with toxic parents as an adult requires overcoming both external pressure and internal guilt. Other family members, friends, and society in general may criticize you for not being more understanding or forgiving toward your parents. You may feel guilty for setting limits with people who raised you and provided for you during childhood. The key is remembering that gratitude for past care doesn't require accepting present abuse. You can appreciate what your parents did for you as a child while still protecting yourself from their toxic behavior as an adult. Boundaries aren't punishment or revenge. They're necessary protection for your mental health and success. Toxic siblings often compete for parental attention and resources well into adulthood, creating ongoing drama and conflict at family gatherings. They may try to recreate childhood dynamics where you played specific roles like the scapegoat, the golden child, or the caretaker. Breaking free from these roles requires conscious effort and consistent boundary enforcement. The family role reset technique involves refusing to play the role that toxic family members expect you to play. If you were always the peacemaker who smoothed over conflicts, you stop automatically jumping in to fix family problems. If you were the responsible one who took care of everyone else's needs, you start prioritizing your own needs and letting others handle their own problems. Holiday gatherings and family events require special strategies because these occasions often force you to interact with toxic family members in close quarters for extended periods. The key is planning your approach in advance, rather than hoping things will go smoothly or trying to manage situations reactively. Pre-event planning includes deciding how long you'll stay, what topics you will and won't discuss, how you'll respond to predictable triggering behavior, and what your exit strategy will be if things become unbearable. You might decide to stay in a hotel rather than in the family home, limit your visit to a few hours rather than a few days, or bring a supportive friend or partner who can help you maintain perspective. The broken record for family technique involves preparing standard responses for common family manipulation tactics. When relatives try to guilt you about your boundaries, ask inappropriate questions, or bring up old grievances, you have predetermined responses that you can repeat calmly without getting drawn into lengthy explanations or justifications. For example, if a family member says, "You've changed, you used to be so much more fun," you might respond with, "I'm happy with who I am now," and then change the subject or excuse yourself from the conversation. You don't explain why you've changed, defend your current personality, or argue about whether the change is positive or negative. Managing family inheritance and financial issues often brings out the worst in toxic relatives because money and property represent power, security, and parental favoritism. These situations can destroy family relationships permanently if not handled carefully. The key is approaching inheritance issues as business transactions rather than emotional negotiations. Document all agreements in writing. Involve neutral third parties, like attorneys or financial advisors, when necessary. And don't make financial decisions based on guilt, manipulation, or promises of future family harmony. Toxic family members often use inheritance discussions as opportunities to relitigate old grievances or extract commitments that serve their interests. The information boundaries technique is crucial for family relationships because toxic relatives often use personal information to create drama, manipulate other family members, or interfere in your life. Limit what you share about your career, relationships, financial situation, and personal struggles. Share only positive, general updates that can't be used against you later. This doesn't mean being dishonest or secretive. It means being selective about what information serves your relationships and what information creates vulnerability. You can be warm and loving with family members while still maintaining appropriate privacy about your personal life. Finally, remember that you get to define what family means to you as an adult. Family isn't just about biological relationships. It's about people who support your growth, respect your boundaries, and contribute positively to your life. Sometimes the family you choose through friendships and partnerships is healthier and more supportive than the family you were born into. Creating boundaries with biological family members while building chosen family relationships allows you to honor your heritage and history while also protecting your future and well-being. You don't have to choose between family loyalty and personal success, but you do have to choose how much energy you'll invest in relationships that drain rather than energize you. Chapter 13. Building toxic-proof life systems for long-term protection. Once you've learned to identify and handle toxic people, the next level of mastery involves building life systems that naturally repel toxic individuals and attract positive, supportive people. This is about creating an environment where toxic behavior simply doesn't work, where healthy boundaries are the norm, and where your energy is consistently protected and renewed rather than drained and depleted. The foundation of a toxic-proof life is what I call conscious social curation. Most people accept whatever social connections happen to come their way through work, family, geography, or circumstance. They don't actively choose their social environment, which means they often end up surrounded by people who don't support their goals or well-being. Conscious social curation means being intentional about who you spend time with, who you give access to your energy and attention, and who influences your thinking and decision-making. This doesn't mean being elitist or exclusionary. It means recognizing that your social environment has a massive impact on your success, happiness, and mental health. Start by conducting a social audit of your current relationships. List the people you interact with regularly and honestly assess how each relationship affects your energy, mood, and progress toward your goals. Do you feel energized or drained after spending time with them? Do they support your ambitions or discourage them? Do they bring out your best qualities or your worst? This audit will reveal patterns you might not have noticed before. You might discover that certain friends consistently leave you feeling negative or insecure, that some family members always create drama when you're making positive changes in your life, or that particular colleagues undermine your confidence and motivation. Once you've identified these patterns, you can make conscious choices about how much time and energy to invest in each relationship. This doesn't necessarily mean cutting people out completely. but it does mean being strategic about when, where, and how you interact with them. The second component of toxic-proof life systems is environmental design. Your physical and digital environments should support healthy boundaries and positive interactions while making toxic behavior difficult or unrewarding. This includes everything from how you arrange your living space to how you manage your online presence. In your physical environment, create spaces that feel calm, organized, and under your control. Toxic people thrive in chaotic, stressful environments, where boundaries are unclear and emotions run high. When your physical space reflects order and intentionality, it naturally discourages toxic behavior and makes boundary violations more obvious. Your digital environment is equally important because toxic people often use technology to violate boundaries, manipulate emotions, or demand attention. Take control of your phone, email, and social media accounts by setting specific times for checking messages, turning off non-essential notifications, and blocking or muting people who consistently create negativity in your digital space. The communication gatekeeper system is a powerful tool for managing access to your time and attention. Instead of being available to everyone at all times, create structured ways for people to communicate with you that give you control over when and how you respond. This might mean setting specific office hours when you're available for phone calls, requiring people to schedule meetings in advance rather than dropping by unexpectedly, or using email for most communication, so you can respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. The goal is to make your time and attention something that requires effort to access, rather than something that's freely available to anyone who demands it. Building a support network strategy is crucial for long-term protection because toxic people often target individuals who appear isolated or unsupported. When you have strong, positive relationships with multiple people, you're less vulnerable to manipulation and more likely to receive reality checks when someone tries to gaslight you. Your support network should include different types of relationships that serve different functions. Mentors who guide your professional development, peers who share your interests and goals, friends who provide emotional support and fun, and professionals like therapists or coaches who help you maintain perspective and process difficult experiences. Diversifying your support network prevents you from becoming too dependent on any single relationship and ensures that you have multiple sources of feedback, encouragement, and assistance. This makes you less vulnerable to toxic people who try to isolate you from others or position themselves as your only source of support. The personal standards framework involves clearly defining what behavior you will and won't accept in your relationships and consistently enforcing these standards regardless of who violates them. Many people have different standards for different relationships, which creates confusion and inconsistency that toxic people exploit. Your personal standards should be based on your values and goals, rather than on social expectations or other people's comfort levels. These standards should address communication style, respect for boundaries, reciprocity in giving and receiving support, and basic courtesy and kindness. Once you've defined your standards, communicate them clearly and enforce them consistently. This doesn't mean announcing your standards dramatically or lecturing people about proper behavior. It means demonstrating through your actions what you will and won't tolerate, and following through with consequences when your standards are violated. The energy investment portfolio approach treats your relationships like financial investments, allocating your time and energy based on the returns you receive. Just as you wouldn't continue investing money in assets that consistently lose value, you shouldn't continue investing emotional energy in relationships that consistently drain rather than energize you. This requires tracking the energy returns from your relationships over time and adjusting your investment levels accordingly. Relationships that consistently provide positive returns deserve increased investment, while relationships that consistently provide negative returns should receive reduced investment or be eliminated entirely. The final component of toxic-proof life systems is continuous learning and adaptation. Toxic people evolve their tactics, and new types of toxic behavior emerge as society changes. Staying protected requires continuously updating your knowledge and skills for recognizing and handling difficult people. This means staying informed about psychology and relationship dynamics, practicing your boundary setting and communication skills regularly, and learning from each toxic interaction you encounter. Every difficult person you deal with teaches you something about human behavior and provides an opportunity to refine your protective strategies. Building toxic-proof life systems takes time and effort, but the investment pays dividends for the rest of your life. When your environment naturally supports healthy relationships and discourages toxic behavior, you spend less energy managing difficult people and more energy pursuing your goals and enjoying positive connections with others. Chapter 14. Recovery and Rebuilding After Toxic Relationship Damage. If you've been in long-term relationships with toxic people, whether personal or professional, you've likely suffered psychological damage that affects your ability to trust, your self-confidence, and your capacity for healthy relationships. Recovery isn't just about removing toxic people from your life. It's about healing the internal damage they've caused and rebuilding your ability to recognize and maintain healthy connections. The first step in recovery is acknowledging the extent of the damage without minimizing or dramatizing it. Toxic people affect their targets in predictable ways. They erode self-confidence, create anxiety and hypervigilance, distort thinking patterns, and damage the ability to trust your own perceptions and judgments. These effects are real and significant, but they're also reversible with conscious effort and appropriate support. Many people who've been in toxic relationships suffer from what psychologists call complex trauma or emotional abuse syndrome. This isn't as severe as post-traumatic stress disorder, but it involves similar symptoms: difficulty concentrating, sleep problems, emotional numbness or overwhelming emotions, social withdrawal, and persistent negative thoughts about yourself and others. Understanding that these symptoms are normal responses to abnormal treatment is crucial for recovery. You're not weak, damaged, or broken because you've been affected by toxic behavior. You're a normal person who responded normally to an abnormal situation. The symptoms you're experiencing are evidence of your humanity, not proof of your inadequacy. The reality recalibration process involves relearning to trust your own perceptions and judgments after they've been systematically undermined by gaslighting and manipulation. Toxic people deliberately confuse their targets about reality, making them question their memory, their interpretations of events, and their emotional responses to mistreatment. Recovery requires systematically rebuilding confidence in your ability to perceive reality accurately. Start by keeping a journal where you record your thoughts, feelings, and observations without editing or second-guessing yourself. Notice when you automatically assume you're wrong or when you dismiss your own concerns as overreactions. Practice validating your own experiences instead of seeking external validation for everything you think and feel. When something feels wrong to you, trust that feeling even if you can't immediately explain why. Your intuition about people and situations is probably much more accurate than you've been led to believe. The Boundary Reconstruction Project involves relearning how to set and maintain healthy boundaries after they've been systematically violated or ignored. People who've been in toxic relationships often lose touch with their own needs, preferences, and limits because they've spent so much energy accommodating others or avoiding conflict. Start small by identifying minor preferences and honoring them consistently. This might mean choosing what to eat for lunch without asking others for their opinion, deciding what to watch on television without defaulting to others' preferences, or saying no to small requests that you don't want to fulfill. Gradually work up to larger boundary-setting challenges as your confidence and skills improve. The goal is to rebuild your natural ability to recognize your own needs and assert them appropriately, even when others disagree or express displeasure with your choices. The Self-Compassion Development Program addresses the internal criticism and negative self-talk that toxic people often instill in their targets. When someone repeatedly tells you that you're too sensitive, too demanding, too difficult, or not good enough, you eventually internalize these messages and continue the abuse internally, even after the external abuser is gone. Recovery requires consciously replacing this internal criticism with self-compassion and realistic self-assessment. When you notice negative self-talk, ask yourself whether you would say the same things to a good friend in a similar situation. If the answer is no, then you're being unnecessarily harsh with yourself. Practice speaking to yourself with the same kindness and understanding you would offer to someone you care about. This doesn't mean avoiding accountability or making excuses for your mistakes. It means treating yourself with basic human dignity and respect while you learn and grow. The trust rebuilding strategy involves gradually relearning how to assess people's trustworthiness and build healthy relationships after being betrayed or manipulated. Many people swing between two extremes after toxic relationships, either trusting no one or trusting everyone indiscriminately. Neither approach is healthy or effective. Healthy trust is earned gradually through consistent behavior over time. Start by observing people's actions rather than just listening to their words. Notice whether they follow through on commitments, respect boundaries, treat others with kindness, and demonstrate integrity in small situations. Build trust incrementally by sharing small vulnerabilities and observing how people handle the information you give them. Do they respect your privacy, use the information to support you, or exploit it for their own advantage? Let people earn your trust through demonstrated reliability rather than giving it automatically or withholding it permanently. The Relationship Skills Rehabilitation Program addresses the fact that people who've been in toxic relationships often lose confidence in their ability to maintain healthy connections. They may become overly accommodating to avoid conflict, overly suspicious to avoid being hurt again, or overly independent to avoid needing anyone. Healthy relationships require skills that toxic relationships prevent you from developing: clear communication, conflict resolution, emotional regulation, and reciprocal support. These skills can be learned and practiced in low-risk situations with safe people who support your growth. Consider working with a therapist who specializes in relationship trauma, joining support groups with others who've had similar experiences, or practicing relationship skills with trusted friends who understand your recovery process. The goal is to rebuild confidence in your ability to create and maintain positive connections with others. The personal power restoration process involves reclaiming your sense of agency and control over your own life. Toxic people systematically undermine their target's confidence in their own decision-making abilities, making them feel helpless and dependent. Recovery requires rebuilding your sense of personal power and effectiveness. Start by making small decisions independently and following through on them successfully. This might involve choosing new activities to try, setting and achieving small goals, or solving problems that arise in your daily life. Each successful independent action rebuilds confidence in your ability to handle whatever life presents. Finally, remember that recovery is not a linear process. You'll have good days and bad days, setbacks and breakthroughs. Some days you'll feel strong and confident. Other days you'll feel vulnerable and uncertain. This is normal and doesn't mean you're not making progress. The goal isn't to become invulnerable to all future hurt or to never trust anyone again. The goal is to rebuild your natural ability to discern between healthy and unhealthy people, to set appropriate boundaries, and to create relationships that support your growth and well-being rather than undermining them. Chapter 15. Maintaining your edge. How successful people stay protected while building empires. The ultimate test of your ability to handle toxic people isn't just protecting yourself from their attacks. It's maintaining your upward trajectory while they try to drag you down. Successful people understand that toxic individuals will always exist, and they build systems and mindsets that allow them to continue growing and achieving while navigating these challenges strategically. The most successful people in the world don't avoid toxic people entirely, because that's impossible if you want to build anything significant. Whether you're starting a business, climbing the corporate ladder, building a platform, or creating wealth, you'll encounter people who try to sabotage your success out of jealousy, insecurity, or simple malice. The key is learning to handle these encounters without losing momentum or compromising your values. The strategic detachment principle is fundamental to maintaining success while dealing with toxic people. This involves caring deeply about your goals and values while remaining emotionally detached from other people's opinions, reactions, and approval. Most people sacrifice their success because they're too invested in being liked or avoiding conflict with people who don't support their growth. Strategic detachment doesn't mean becoming cold or uncaring. It means recognizing that your mission is more important than any individual relationship. When someone tries to manipulate you into lowering your standards, abandoning your goals, or accepting less than you deserve, you evaluate their requests based on whether they align with your objectives rather than on whether refusing will hurt their feelings. The competitive advantage framework recognizes that your ability to handle toxic people effectively is actually a significant competitive advantage in business and life. While most people get derailed by difficult personalities, waste energy on drama, or compromise their standards to avoid conflict, you continue moving forward strategically and purposefully. This advantage compounds over time because consistency in the face of adversity builds reputation and trust. When others see that you maintain your integrity and focus regardless of external pressure, they become more likely to want to work with you, invest in you, and support your initiatives. Your ability to handle toxic people becomes part of your professional brand. The energy amplification strategy involves using encounters with toxic people as fuel for your ambition rather than allowing them to drain your motivation. Every time someone tries to tear you down, dismiss your abilities, or sabotage your progress, you use their negativity as evidence that you're on the right track and moving in a direction that threatens their status quo. This psychological reframe transforms toxic encounters from energy drains into energy sources. Instead of feeling defeated when someone tries to undermine you, you feel energized because their behavior confirms that you're growing beyond their level and representing something they fear or envy. The network leverage system involves building relationships with other successful people who understand how to handle toxic individuals strategically. When you surround yourself with people who've dealt with similar challenges and maintained their success despite opposition, you gain access to advanced strategies and emotional support that most people never receive. These network relationships also provide protection because toxic people are less likely to attack someone who has powerful allies. When you're connected to other successful, respected individuals, attacking you becomes more costly and risky for potential adversaries. Your network becomes a form of insurance against toxic behavior. The documentation and evidence protocol becomes more sophisticated as your success grows because the stakes of toxic attacks increase. Early in your career, a toxic person might just make your day unpleasant. As you become more successful, they might try to damage your reputation, sabotage your business deals, or interfere with your opportunities. Advanced documentation involves not just keeping records of toxic behavior, but building comprehensive evidence files that include witnesses, corroborating evidence, and third-party verification of your version of events. This isn't paranoia. It's professional protection in an environment where your reputation and opportunities are valuable targets. The influence and authority development strategy recognizes that the more influence you have, the better you can protect yourself and others from toxic behavior. When you have authority, resources, and respect, you can set standards for how people interact within your sphere of influence and impose consequences for toxic behavior. This might involve creating workplace cultures that don't tolerate toxic behavior, choosing business partners who share your values, or using your platform to educate others about healthy relationship dynamics. Your success gives you the power to create environments where toxic behavior is discouraged and positive behavior is rewarded. The legacy protection mindset involves thinking beyond immediate conflicts to consider how your responses to toxic people will affect your long-term reputation and impact. Every interaction is an opportunity to demonstrate the qualities you want to be known for: integrity, strategic thinking, grace under pressure, and commitment to your values. This long-term perspective helps you avoid reactive responses that might feel satisfying in the moment, but damage your reputation over time. It also helps you stay focused on building something meaningful, rather than getting distracted by short-term conflicts with people who ultimately don't matter to your success. The mentorship and teaching integration strategy involves using your experiences with toxic people to help others who are facing similar challenges. As you become more successful, you naturally encounter people who are earlier in their journey and struggling with toxic individuals in their own lives. Sharing your knowledge and experience not only helps others, it reinforces your own learning and creates positive relationships that counterbalance the negative energy from toxic encounters. Teaching others how to handle difficult people also establishes you as a leader and authority in this area. Finally, remember that your ability to handle toxic people while maintaining your success and integrity is one of the most valuable skills you can develop. It affects every area of your life, your career advancement, your business success, your relationships, and your overall well-being and happiness. The strategies and techniques you've learned in this comprehensive guide aren't just tools for dealing with difficult people. They're tools for creating a life where you have control over your environment, your relationships, and your outcomes. When you master these skills, you join the small percentage of people who refuse to let toxic individuals derail their success or compromise their values. Your success becomes a form of justice, proving that integrity, strategic thinking, and commitment to growth are more powerful than manipulation, toxicity, and destructive behavior. Every goal you achieve despite toxic opposition is a victory not just for you, but for everyone who believes that good people can succeed without becoming bad people in the process. The world needs more successful people who understand how to handle toxic individuals without becoming toxic themselves. Your success with these principles doesn't just improve your own life, it creates a model for others to follow and contributes to a culture where toxic behavior is less tolerated and less effective. This is your competitive advantage, your protection system, and your contribution to making the world a place where success and integrity can coexist. Use these tools wisely, implement them consistently, and never forget that your ability to rise above toxic people while maintaining your values is one of the most powerful demonstrations of true strength and success.